The night is ink black, August 7, 1588. Off the coast of Calais, the largest fleet Europe has ever seen lies at anchor. 130 Spanish warships, a floating city of wood, iron, and faith, bobbing gently in the English Channel. King Philip II's invincible armada. Their mission, to cross this narrow strip of water, pick up the Duke of Parma's 30,000 elite soldiers, and invade England, crushing Queen Elizabeth's Protestant regime once and for all. For 10 days, they have fought their way up the Channel, harried by smaller, faster English ships, but their famous crescent formation has held. It is unbreakable, they are invincible. The Spanish admiral, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, believes the worst is over. The English are low on ammunition, his fleet is intact. All they have to do is wait for Parma, but the English have one last, desperate card to play. A little after midnight, the Spanish lookout see it. 2 faint lights, moving towards them from the English fleet. Then 4, then 8. They aren't warships. They're smaller, and they're moving strangely, carried by the wind and tide. As they drift closer, the horrible truth dawns. These aren't attack ships, they're fire ships. 8 floating bombs, packed with anything that will burn pitch, tar, gunpowder, and sent directly into the heart of the anchored armada. Panic erupts. An admiral who cuts his anchor cable in a panic is a dead man. It's the ultimate disgrace, but the alternative is to be consumed by a floating inferno. The Spanish captains face an impossible choice. Aboard his flagship, the San Martin, Medina Sidonia watches in horror. He signals the fleet, weigh anchor, and reform in open water. But it's too late. The orders are lost in the shouting and the darkness. One by one, then in a cascade of terror, Spanish captains give the unthinkable command: cut the cables. Massive anchor ropes, as thick as a man's arm, are hacked apart with axes. The giant galleons, some weighing over 1,000 tons, are suddenly free, drifting helplessly at the mercy of the wind and current. The perfect, disciplined crescent formation, the key to their entire strategy, dissolves into a terrified mob. The ships crash into each other in the darkness, masts splinter or snap. Men scream as they are crushed between grinding hulls. The invincible armada has lost its anchor, its discipline, and its nerve. This was exactly what the English commander, Lord Howard, and his Vice Admiral, Sir Francis Drake, had planned. They didn't need the fire ships to burn the armada. They just needed to make them panic, to break their formation. As dawn breaks on August 8th, the Spanish fleet is scattered, disorganized, and sailing northeast, pushed by the southwesterly wind. They are off the coast of a town called Gravelines. And the English fleet, all 150 of them, are right behind, smelling blood. The battle that follows will not be a chivalrous exchange of cannon fire at a distance. It will be a brutal, close-quarters slugging match that will decide the fate of England and change the course of European history forever. The English have a crucial advantage. Their ships are smaller, yes, but they are purpose-built warships. They are faster, more maneuverable, and their cannons are a revolutionary new design. They are mounted on 4-wheeled carriages, which means they can be reloaded and fired much, much faster than the Spanish guns. The Spanish galleons, on the other hand, are magnificent but clumsy. They are essentially armed merchant vessels, designed more for transporting cargo and troops than for naval combat. Their heavy cannons are mounted on simple 2-wheeled carriages, making them incredibly difficult to reload in the heat of battle. Many can only be fired once. The Spanish plan was never to fight a naval battle. It was to get close, grapple, board, and let their superior infantry overwhelm the English sailors in hand-to-hand combat. But now, the English are determined not to let them get close. The Battle of Gravelines begins. The English ships dart in and out, firing devastating broadsides into the lumbering Spanish galleons from as close as 100 yards. The sound is apocalyptic, a continuous, deafening roar of cannon fire that can be heard on the shores of France and England. Wooden hulls splinter, masts topple, sails are shredded into ribbons. The Spanish can do little but endure the punishment. Their own cannonballs often fly high over the smaller English ships, while the English gunners systematically tear the Spanish fleet apart. The decks of the galleons run with blood. Priests walk among the dead and dying, offering last rites. Yet, the Spanish soldiers and sailors show incredible courage. They refuse to surrender. They fight back with muskets, trying to pick off English gunners, but it's a hopeless fight. One ship, the San Mateo, is assaulted by multiple English vessels, including Drake's flagship, the Revenge. It takes a pounding for hours, its hull riddled with holes, its masts gone, half its crew dead or wounded. Another, the San Felipe, tries to come to its aid and suffers the same fate. The two ships drift away, shattered and sinking, eventually running aground on the Dutch coast where their surviving crews are either captured or killed by the locals. Throughout the day, at least 5 major Spanish ships are lost, either sunk or driven ashore. Thousands of men are killed. The English, by contrast, suffer minimal damage and fewer than 100 casualties. They have fought one of the most decisive naval battles in history, almost without loss. As evening falls, the slaughter finally ends. Not because of a ceasefire, but because the English have run out of ammunition. They have fired their cannons almost non-stop for 8 hours. The Spanish Armada is a wreck. It's still a fleet, but it is broken, battered, and utterly demoralized. Medina Sidonia knows the invasion is impossible. The link-up with Parma's army has failed. Their formation is gone. The wind is still blowing from the southwest, pushing them remorselessly north, into the cold, unfamiliar, and treacherous North Sea. There is only one way home now, the long way. Around the top of Scotland and the west coast of Ireland, it is a desperate gamble. These ships, designed for the calmer waters of the Mediterranean and the Atlantic trade winds, are not built for the savage storms of the North Atlantic. Many are barely seaworthy after the battle. Their supplies are low, their crews are exhausted and sick. And their charts for these waters are dangerously inaccurate. The long voyage home becomes a new kind of hell. As the Armada sails north, the English fleet follows, just to make sure they don't turn back. But the real enemy now is the weather. What the English cannons started, the Atlantic storms will finish. Off the coast of Scotland and Ireland, the fleet is hit by a series of ferocious gales. The Protestant wind, the English will call it. Ships that had survived the inferno of gravelines are now thrown against the rocky shores of a hostile land. One galleon, the Girona, loaded with the crews and treasures from 2 other wrecked ships, hits the rocks at Lochata Point in County Antrim, Ireland. Of the 1,300 men on board, only 9 survive. Another 24 ships are wrecked on the Irish coast. Survivors who struggle ashore are often killed by English garrisons or local Irish scavengers. They had expected to land in Ireland as liberators of their fellow Catholics, but they were met with slaughter. Medina Sidonia, on his battered flagship, manages to hold a core of the fleet together and eventually limps back to Santander in northern Spain in late September. Other ships straggle in over the next few weeks. But of the 130 ships that set out with such pomp and confidence, only around 65 return. More than half the fleet is lost. Of the 30,000 men who sailed, perhaps 10,000 make it home. Most died not in battle, but from storms, shipwreck, starvation, and disease. It is a catastrophe of staggering proportions. When a courtier rushed to tell King Philip the news of the disaster, the deeply religious king is said to have calmly replied, "I sent the Armada against men, not God's winds and waves." He ordered prayers of thanks for the survivors and immediately began planning a new Armada. But the myth of Spanish invincibility was shattered forever. The defeat was a colossal blow to Spain's prestige and a massive boost to English morale. It secured the English Reformation and allowed England to emerge as a major naval power. Queen Elizabeth's speech to her troops at Tilbury, even though it was delivered after the danger had passed, became legendary. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." The victory ushered in an era of national pride and confidence, laying the groundwork for the future British Empire. The golden age of Elizabeth had been forged in the fire and storms of 1588. The defeat of the Armada wasn't just a military victory, it was a turning point. It marked the beginning of the end for Spain as the world's dominant power and the beginning of the rise of England. The balance of power in Europe had been redrawn, not by armies on land, but by cannons, courage, and the cruel winds of the North Atlantic.
History isn't just what happened, it's what was hidden. Welcome to the Chrono Archives, where lost empires rise again, forgotten legends speak, and ancient truths are brought back to life. From world-shaping history and powerful myths to legendary rulers and timeless civilizations, every story here is carefully uncovered, deeply researched, and cinematically told. The past is calling, will you answer? Subscribe and journey through time, one unforgettable chronicle at a time.
In the late 16th century, Europe was a crucible of political and religious conflict. At the center of this turmoil stood two rival powers, Catholic Spain, ruled by the devout and powerful King Philip II, and Protestant England, led by the formidable Queen Elizabeth I. Philip, who saw himself as the defender of the Catholic faith, viewed Elizabeth's Protestant England as a heretical state and a direct threat to his authority. Tensions had been escalating for years. English privateers, often with tacit approval from the Crown, raided Spanish treasure fleets returning from the New World, disrupting the flow of wealth that sustained Spain's vast empire. Furthermore, England provided support to the Protestant Dutch rebels fighting for independence from Spanish rule in the Netherlands. For Philip, these provocations, combined with his desire to return England to the Catholic fold, made an invasion seem not just necessary, but a holy obligation. His plan, the enterprise of England, was audacious. A massive naval fleet would sail up the English Channel, rendezvous with the elite Spanish army stationed in the Netherlands under the command of the Duke of Parma, and transport these troops across the strait for a full-scale invasion. The objective was clear: depose Elizabeth, crush Protestantism, and install a Catholic monarch on the English throne. In response, England braced for the inevitable. The nation was on high alert, with a system of signal beacons prepared along the coast. While its army was small and less experienced than Spain's, its navy was its primary shield. Under the command of Lord Howard of Effingham, and with skilled sea captains like Sir Francis Drake and Sir John Hawkins, the English fleet was being readied for a desperate defense of the realm. The Spanish Armada, when it finally assembled, was the largest fleet Europe had ever seen. It comprised approximately 130 ships, crewed by over 8,000 sailors and carrying nearly 19,000 soldiers. This formidable force included mighty galleons, towering war vessels designed for both transport and combat, alongside hulks, pinnaces, and a squadron of galleasses hybrid ships that combined sails with oars for maneuverability. The Armada was commanded by the Duke of Medina Sidonia, a high-ranking nobleman chosen for his status rather than his naval experience. While a competent administrator, he lacked the seafaring instincts of his English counterparts. The Spanish strategy was predicated on a close-quarters battle. Their ships were built as floating platforms for soldiers, designed to grapple with enemy vessels, board them, and overwhelm their crews in hand-to-hand combat. Their cannons were primarily heavy, short-range siege guns, intended to deliver a powerful initial blow before the infantry assault. However, this strength was also a weakness. The sheer scale of the enterprise created immense logistical challenges. Supplies of food, water, and ammunition were difficult to maintain, and the barrels holding provisions were often poorly made, leading to spoilage. The Spanish strategic assumption relied entirely on a successful link-up with Parma's army, a maneuver that required precise timing and control of the sea, which was far from guaranteed. In stark contrast, the English navy was built for a different kind of warfare. While smaller in overall tonnage, the English fleet consisted of nimbler, more maneuverable race-built galleons. These ships sat lower in the water, were faster, and could sail closer to the wind than their bulky Spanish adversaries. The English command structure was more fluid, led by seasoned mariners who knew the treacherous waters of the Channel intimately. Their primary advantage lay in gunnery. English ships were equipped with a greater number of long-range culverins. These cannons, while firing a lighter shot, could be reloaded faster and fired more accurately over greater distances. This allowed the English to adopt innovative hit-and-run tactics, staying out of the range of the Armada's heavy cannons and avoiding the dreaded Spanish boarding parties. Their strategy was not to sink the Spanish galleons outright, a difficult task given their robust construction, but to harass them, break their formation, and wear them down through a continuous war of attrition. The English understood that their survival depended on keeping the Armada at arm's length, using their superior speed and gunnery to inflict damage from a safe distance. After several delays, the Armada set sail from Lisbon in late May 1588, but was immediately forced back by storms, requiring repairs and resupply. It finally departed from Corunna in late July, entering the English Channel a week later. On July 29th, the Spanish fleet was sighted off the Lizard, the southernmost point of England. The warning beacons were lit, sending a chain of fire across the country. The English fleet, harbored in Plymouth, was initially trapped by the incoming tide and an unfavorable wind. In a remarkable feat of seamanship, they managed to warp their ships out of the harbor and gain the crucial weather gauge, the upwind position that gave them control of the engagement. The Spanish, adhering to strict orders, formed a tight, defensive crescent formation with the powerful warships on the flanks and the weaker transport vessels in the center. This formation was formidable and difficult to penetrate. Over the next week, a running battle ensued as the Armada moved slowly and majestically up the channel. The English ships, commanded by Howard, Drake, and Frobisher, swooped in to attack the horns of the crescent, firing broadsides before sailing out of range. While these attacks caused some damage and sowed confusion, they failed to break the Spanish discipline. The Armada's formation held firm. The Spanish command, however, was growing frustrated. They were unable to force the English into a close-quarters fight, and their ammunition was being slowly depleted without significant result. The logistical strain began to tell as the fleet inched its way toward its rendezvous point off the coast of Flanders. On August 6th, the Armada reached the port of Calais and dropped anchor, awaiting word from the Duke of Parma. This proved to be a critical and ultimately fatal pause. Parma's army was not ready. His troops were blockaded in their ports by a fleet of shallow-draft Dutch flyboats, which the deep-draft Spanish galleons could not engage in the coastal shoals. The planned rendezvous was impossible. Medina Sidonia's fleet was now a stationary target, anchored in a dangerous position exposed to the wind and tide. The English commanders recognized their opportunity. In the dead of night on August 7th, they launched their most famous and effective attack. 8 Hellburners, old ships filled with flammable materials, were set ablaze and sent drifting on the wind and tide toward the densely packed Spanish fleet. Panic erupted among the Spanish crews. Although the fire ships caused no direct damage, the psychological impact was immense. To escape the flames, Spanish captains cut their anchor cables, their only connection to the seabed. The disciplined crescent formation, which had held for over a week, was irrevocably broken. The ships, now scattered and adrift without their heavy anchors, were at the mercy of the northeasterly wind, which pushed them out into the North Sea. The following morning, August 8th, the decisive engagement of the campaign took place, the Battle of Gravelines. The English fleet, holding the weather gauge, closed in on the disorganized and scattered Spanish ships off the Flemish coast. What followed was not a traditional battle line engagement, but a brutal, close-range melee lasting for over 8 hours. The English ships now had the advantage. They used their superior maneuverability to sail circles around the lumbering Spanish galleons, pouring relentless cannon fire into their hulls at close range. The faster-firing English guns inflicted terrible damage. Hulls were splintered, rigging was torn apart, and decks were swept with lethal shot. Spanish gunnery proved slow and ineffective. Their gunners were not trained for rapid reloading in the heat of battle, and many of their cannonballs had been poorly cast. Despite the horrific punishment, the Spanish soldiers and sailors fought with incredible bravery. Several Spanish ships were battered into wrecks, with some running aground and others on the verge of sinking, but only a few were lost in the battle itself. The tactical miscalculations of the Spanish command were laid bare. Their plan for a boarding action had failed, and their ships were not designed for a prolonged artillery duel. As the day wore on, the Spanish began to run critically low on ammunition, while the English continued their assault. A sudden squall and a shift in the wind finally brought the battle to an end, saving the remnants of the Armada from complete annihilation and pushing them further into the unforgiving waters of the North Sea. The Battle of Gravelines shattered the Armada's fighting capability and ended any hope of an invasion. With the prevailing southwesterly winds now blocking any return path through the English Channel, Medina Sidonia made the desperate decision to attempt a retreat by circumnavigating Scotland and Ireland. This journey would prove more devastating than any battle. The fleet was in a terrible state. Ships were heavily damaged, provisions were nearly exhausted, and water was scarce. The crews were weakened by combat, hunger, and disease. As they sailed north, they were relentlessly battered by a series of severe Atlantic storms. Navigation was a nightmare. Charts were inaccurate, and the Spanish pilots were unfamiliar with the treacherous northern coastlines. Dozens of ships were driven onto the rocky shores of Scotland and, most devastatingly, Western Ireland. For the thousands of Spanish soldiers and sailors who survived the initial shipwrecks, a worse fate often awaited. Many were killed by local inhabitants or by English garrisons who showed no mercy. Morale within the surviving fleet collapsed. Disease, particularly typhus and dysentery, ran rampant. Ships became floating coffins. Of the 130 ships that had set sail with such confidence, only about half limped back to Spanish ports over the following months. The immediate aftermath was stark. Spain had suffered a catastrophic loss of ships, experienced sailors, and veteran soldiers. The financial cost was crippling, and the psychological blow to the nation's prestige was immense. For England, the victory was a moment of profound national triumph and relief. The threat of invasion had been lifted, and the Protestant nation had survived against overwhelming odds. The performance of the English Navy affirmed its strategic shift toward faster ships and superior gunnery, boosting national confidence and cementing Elizabeth's rule. The defeat of the Armada did not end the war between England and Spain, which would continue for another 16 years. However, it marked a significant strategic turning point. It damaged Spain's reputation as an invincible maritime power and signaled the rise of England as a formidable force at sea. The strategic balance in Europe had been altered, and the events of 1588 would echo through the centuries that followed. The Great Armada is gone, not vanquished in a single, thunderous clash of cannon and steel, but unraveled, thread, by forces far older than any empire. The final scenes of this grand drama were not played out in the claustrophobic confines of the English Channel, but on a vast, empty stage of open ocean, under a sky that offered no divine favor. The empty seas tell the real story, where once the world's most formidable fleet sailed in an immaculate crescent, a symbol of divine will and imperial might, there is now only the vast, indifferent expanse of the North Atlantic. The wind and the waves remain, eternal and untroubled by the ambitions of men. Imagine the silence that followed the storm. On the desolate coasts of Ireland and Scotland, the silence was punctuated by the groan of splintering timbers and the cries of drowning men. The very ships that were meant to be instruments of God's will, christened with the names of saints, were now being broken apart by God's own creation. They were no longer vessels of conquest, but tombs of wood and iron, their proud banners and gilded carving swallowed by the murky depths. What does a shipwreck tell us? It speaks of a journey's end, but also of a misplaced faith. It is a monument to the collision between human certainty and the universe's profound indifference. He had built an empire on faith in his God, faith in his divine right to rule, and faith in the invincibility of his great enterprise. The Armada was not merely a fleet, it was an article of that faith made manifest. It was Spain's belief in its own destiny, forged in steel and timber. But the winds that scattered his ships, the Protestant wind as the English called it, listened to no prayers. The fire ships that sent panic through the Spanish lines were a testament to human ingenuity, but the gales that followed were a reminder of nature's raw, untamable power. The illusion of invincibility is a fragile thing. The Armada was to be the ultimate expression of that power, the final, decisive act that would bring a heretical England to its knees and secure Spanish supremacy for generations. But empires do not always crumble under the weight of a single, decisive blow. Sometimes, they simply begin to fray at the edges. But it was the beginning of a doubt, a crack in the mirror of its own self-perception. The world saw that the giant could bleed. The surviving ships, battered and broken, limped back to Spanish ports over the course of months. They brought with them not tales of victory, but of storms, starvation, and despair. They brought back ghosts. For the English, it was a miracle, a sign of their own divine protection. A narrative of destiny was simply replaced by another. But the truth is more complex and more sobering. It is a story of overconfidence meeting desperation, of rigid planning clashing with agile improvisation, and of human ambition being humbled by the sheer, unthinking force of the natural world. The sea did not choose a side, it simply was. Walk along the shores of County Sligo or the Hebrides today. The waves crash against the rocks with the same timeless rhythm as they did in 1588. There are no grand monuments here to the thousands who perished. The land has absorbed the wreckage, the sea has claimed the rest. The memory of the Great Fleet is a ghost story, a whisper in the wind. This is the ultimate fate of power that believes itself absolute. It doesn't get to write its own epitaph. The ocean, the wind, and the silent coastline offer a more enduring testament. They remind us that the world is not a stage for our dramas, but a vast, wild place that we inhabit only by its consent. The legacy of the Armada is not found in the battles, but in the aftermath. It's in the slow, creeping realization within Spain that its golden age was finite. It's in the burgeoning confidence of England, a nation that began to see the oceans not as a barrier, but as a path to its own empire. History turned on a hinge of wind and water. The failure was not just military, it was philosophical. Spain believed its cause was righteous and therefore blessed. But the universe does not operate on the principles of human morality. A storm has no allegiance, a fire has no creed. Look at the portraits of the men who orchestrated this grand design. Philip in his severe black, Medina Sidonia, the reluctant admiral, burdened by an impossible task. Look into their eyes, and you see the weight of conviction. They were not fools. They were men of their time, trapped within a worldview that was about to be profoundly shaken. They believed they were instruments of destiny, but they were ultimately just men, subject to the same fears, the same miscalculations, and the same unforgiving laws of nature as any sailor clinging to a piece of floating wreckage. Their grand strategy was undone, not just by English cannons, but by a reality that was colder, wetter, and far more chaotic than their plans allowed for. The story is a cautionary tale, written across an empty ocean. It serves as a haunting reminder that power is a tide. The sturdest hulls, the most resolute faith, the grandest ambitions all can be broken and scattered by forces beyond our control. The empty coastlines where the Armada met its end are not just historical sites. They are metaphors for the vanity of power, for the quiet and inevitable decay of all things that believe themselves to be permanent. The Great Fleet is gone, and the sea keeps its secrets. So we are left with a question that echoes down through the centuries, a question that every great power must eventually face. Do empires truly fall because of the strength of their enemies, the ones who stand against them with fire and sword? Or do they begin their long, slow collapse from within, at the very moment they start to believe they are untouchable?
As we close this chapter of the Chrono Archives, remember, the past is never truly gone. It waits patiently in the shadows of forgotten ruins, in the echoes of ancient voices, and in the timeless lessons that still guide us today. It waits to be remembered by curious minds like yours. Thank you for joining us on this extraordinary journey through the annals of time. If today's exploration of lost civilizations, mythical legends, or historical enigmas ignited your passion for the past, hit that like button. Drop a comment with your favorite moment or what you'd love to see next, and most importantly, subscribe to the Chrono Archives and continue the journey through time. Turn on notifications so you never miss an episode where we unearth buried secrets, decode ancient mysteries, and bring history's greatest stories back to life. Together, we'll keep the flame of the past burning bright. Until next time, fellow time travelers, keep questioning, keep discovering, and keep remembering. The Chrono Archives, where the past lives forever.